Good morning, good afternoon. Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Dr. Stormy Monks, and I would like to welcome you to our Grand Rounds presentation hosted by the Southwest Center for Pediatric Environmental Health. We are one of 10 pediatric environmental health specialty units, also known as PACEs in the US. And the purpose of the PACU program is to serve as a leading national source of medical information and consultative advice on environmental conditions that influence human health throughout reproduction and pediatric development. To serve part of our mission, we are offering this Grand Round series once a month, typically on the third Thursday of every month. This month on the second, due to the holidays that are upon us. We're grateful that you all have joined us today to hear Dr. Stephen Borron speak on ethylene oxide and its potential dangers to our children. Before I move on, I just want to make sure that everyone is aware that you will not be able to unmute yourself, but if you do have any questions or comments, please put them in the chat and we will get to those. I want to make sure that we acknowledge the EPA and AAP for their contribution to the PACU. Without these organizations, the work of the PACU would not exist. We are offering CME and CNE today for our Grand Rounds. Here is some information that you may need to access those credits. But if you do have any questions in the future, you can call the CME office or email them, and their information is below here. This is also the QR code that you would need for to access the CME. Our next Grand Rounds presentation is Thursday, January 18th, where we will be hearing about radon. And so if you are interested in attending this, please go ahead and use that QR code to register for our presentation. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Dr. Stephen Borron. Dr. Borron is a native of Imperial in rural West Texas. He attended Texas A&M University for a bachelor's degree in zoology. He then completed medical school at the University of Texas Medical Branch in Galveston, Texas. And he then went on to the University of Cincinnati, where he completed a 4-year residency in emergency medicine, a 2-year clinical research fellowship in occupational and environmental medicine, and a clinical preceptorship in medical toxicology. He started here at Texas Tech University Health Sciences Center, El Paso, in our Department of Emergency Medicine, Division of Medical Toxicology in 2009. And he has since obtained his full professor with tenure position. He is currently retired and retired in 2020, yet he still remains a clinical professor in medical toxicology and emergency medicine. So we are so grateful for him joining us today, and we'd like to welcome Dr. Borron.
Thank you, Dr. Monks. I appreciate the kind introduction. Well, thank you very much for attending today. This is a topic that is becoming of more and more interest because of the learnings that we've had in the last few years about the carcinogenicity of ethylene oxide, particularly at lower concentrations and long-term doses. And so I was asked to speak on ethylene oxide, and I think it's a very good topic for this conference. We've already spoken about the PACU National Classroom. I would just encourage you to check it out. There are very good webinars and online courses available there at no charge with CDC credits. Dr. Monk's already mentioned the acknowledgments, so I'll skip through that. In terms of disclosures, I have no relevant conflict of interest. I don't have any financial relations with any of the ineligible companies to disclose. And I will use some brand names here, but it's only to allow attendees to link familiar household products with the manufacturing sources behind them. And no endorsement is intended. I apologize that my camera is acting up. It was blinking to the point I'd worry about somebody having a seizure, so I just shut it down. The objectives today are that our participants should be able to describe at least 3 sources of ethylene oxide at the end of the presentation, to cite at least 3 serious adverse events that are associated with ethylene oxide, including chronic exposures, and to recognize the need to employ the precautionary principle in the decision-making process related to the control of carcinogens. We'll talk at some length about the precautionary principle. In terms of the outline, we'll take a few pre-test questions to assist us in understanding where the audience is and its familiarity with ethylene oxide. I'll introduce ethylene oxide and its sources and importance in industry and commerce, and talk about some of the associated health hazards with a focus on cancer. We'll explore why children may be at greater risk of exposure, look at sources of ethylene oxide in US EPA Region 6, which we're in. It includes New Mexico, Texas, Oklahoma, Louisiana, and Arkansas. And we will describe some of the ways that the EPA is working with industry to attempt to lower ethylene oxide emissions, a laudable goal. So the first question, children are likely to be at greater risk of significant exposure compared to adults during a release of ethylene oxide. And the answer to that is true. Ethylene oxide accumulates closer to the breathing zone of children because it's heavier than air. And additionally, children have more rapid respiratory rates. True, false, the consumption and emissions of ethylene oxide generally are greater in the production of chemicals like ethylene glycol or antifreeze than in the sterilization of medical supplies. And that's true. True, false, given that the vapor density of ethylene oxide is 1.52, informs us that the gas is lighter than air. This is more technical than I probably should be, but it's a technical issue, and so important that we realize that how to recognize a heavier than air gas. The answer here is false. The molecular weights of ethylene oxide and air are 44 and 29 respectively. By definition, the vapor density is the molecular weight of the substance divided by the molecular weight of air. So we get a density of 1.52, which is greater than air. And so higher concentrations are going to be near the floor. Ethylene oxide is considered by both the US EPA and the International Agency for Research on Cancer to be a human carcinogen, cancer-causing agent. This is true. And finally, the slightly sweet odor of ethylene oxide offers a measure of protection to residents living near a facility using ethylene oxide. And this couldn't be any further from the truth. Ethylene oxide can cause cancer at levels far below the odor threshold of 430 parts per million. The odor threshold is the lowest concentration of a certain odor, the odor of a chemical that is perceivable by the human sense of smell. So it smells sweet, and if you're smelling it, you're in trouble. And if you're not smelling it, you might still be in trouble because the odor threshold is so high. Okay, where is ethylene oxide found? What is it used for, and what's its potential to harm? These are some of the uses of ethylene oxide. It's the largest percentage of it goes into making ethylene glycol. It also is used to make polyethylene plastic bottles, sterilization of medical supplies, in some cases food or grains is also done, but We'll talk mostly about medical supply sterilization in this talk. It's used in the production of paper and the production of surface active agents or surfactants and ethanolamines, which you find in household detergents, and also in the production of glycol ethers, like you'd find in Windex or HX liquids. So what is ethylene? Why should I care? Ethylene oxide is flammable, explosive, corrosive, and poisonous, with a slightly sweet odor, which we already demonstrated is not helpful. It's broken down in air slowly. The half-life of ethylene oxide in air is 211 days. So if it's not dissipated by wind or taken away from an area, it takes a long time to break down. Ethylene oxide, we've already said, is heavier than air and is water soluble, but rain will not remove it from the atmosphere. Most important, ethylene oxide is a carcinogen and causes mutations and reproductive toxicity. It's present in many communities in the United States, and we're going to look at some of those places at concentrations that may increase the risk of cancer, not just in the factory or industrial building, but in communities living close by. And that's one of the newer concerns that has come out in the last few years. If we were to look at a safety data sheet for ethylene oxide, these are some of the things that we would find. It's flammable and so can cause thermal burns if it catches fire. It's also explosive. It's a gas used as a gas under pressure, and so that can cause frostbite. It's very cold when it comes out of the pressurized container. When it's taken orally, which would be in the case of, for example, a foodstuff or spice that has been treated with EtO and then it not given enough time for it to dissipate, you could develop nausea, vomiting, weakness, and fatigue. The acute inhalation toxicity can cause lung irritation and injury. It's corrosive, so you can get serious eye damage, corneal burns, chemical burns. But in fact, most of these acute actions are not an issue for the community. It's mostly the chronic problems. And these include genetic defects caused by cell mutagenicity, carcinogenesis, which can result in white blood cell tumors and lymphoma and breast cancer. And then reproductive toxicity, which could cause miscarriage or sterility. These aren't the only concerns related to ethylene oxide. Other non-cancer effects include lung endpoints, hematological endpoints like anemia, neurological endpoints like neuropathy and weakness in the extremities, reproductive effects such as male sterility, developmental problems such as low birth weight and fetal edema. Unfortunately, we couldn't possibly cover all of that today. So the focus today will be on cancer. Ethylene oxide has been recognized as a carcinogen in the production of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, multiple myeloma, chronic lymphocytic leukemia, stomach cancer, and breast cancer. A good bit of this data comes from a large study that was done by the National Institutes for Occupational Safety and Health and by Steenbach. And there are varying estimates of the capacity of ethylene oxide to cause these different tumors. There's some that are generally agreed on, like non-Hodgkin's lymphoma and breast, but the others are maybe a little less evidence for their carcinogenicity. IARC, the International Agency for Research on Cancer, first evaluated EtO for carcinogenicity in 1976. It didn't come to any conclusions, so it looked at the question again in 1984, 1987, 1994, and 2007, and published in 2008 that there was limited evidence for carcinogenicity. And finally, in 2012, confirmed ethylene oxide as a Group 1 human carcinogen. The NCHEM program of the World Health Organization said it was highly likely to be carcinogenic in 2003. I highlighted these dates because it's important to realize that the evidence for carcinogenicity to be sufficient to result in definite associations or causality take years to find out. And in the meantime, many patients who've been exposed to this can die waiting for the association to be established. In the US, ethylene oxide was tentatively scheduled for testing in the first annual report on carcinogens by the National Toxicology Program in 1980. Likewise, it took many years to finally be known as a human carcinogen. This was published in the 9th report on carcinogens in 2000, and the IRIS system of EPA declared EtO as a known human carcinogen in 2016. So years and years pass, and we don't have legislation to control these sources. So that's been a real issue. Looking a little bit further into the timeline of ethylene oxide, it's been around since the 1800s. In 1928, it started to be used as an insecticide, and in fact, they fumigated hospital rooms with it in the 30s and 40s. It was used to sterilize food in 1940, and in 1948 was found to be a mutagen. So this was the first clue that EtO could cause cancer potentially. In the 1950s, it started to be used commonly as a sterilizer of medical instruments. EtO has the advantage that it can be used on materials like plastics and paper and other materials that aren't where it's not feasible to use steam or radiation, perhaps. And so it's been used pretty extensively. This timeline was put together by the Chicago Times related to a ethylene oxide plant near Chicago on the west side of Chicago that was closed down after failing to live up to the expectations of protecting the public. But they noted that in 81, a Shell executive returned from a meeting on industrial carcinogens and declared EtO to be the biggest problem we have right now. In 1987, California declares EtO as a human carcinogen, and in 94, the EPA adopted regulations on EtO emissions from sterilizers. Just quickly, NIOSH studied 18,000 patients, workers, and reported that EtO caused breast cancer and lymphomas in 2003, 2004. The Bush administration declined to update the regulations on EtO at that time and said that further review was needed. EPA issued a draft review of EtO in 2006, but the independent scientific panel, while they agreed that it probably was a human carcinogen, recommended refinement of the risk assessment, which took another 9 years. So in 2016, EPA declared ethylene oxide a known human carcinogen. And in 2018, reported that about 1% of census tracts in the United States face cancer risk that exceed EPA guidelines. Not all EtO sources are equal. Hospitals use generally smaller amounts of ethylene oxide to do local sterilization of packets for surgery, etc. Commercial sterilizers use tons of ethylene oxide per year. And so there's a huge difference in the potential for off-gassing into the community. In addition to the sources we mentioned, there are endogenous sources of ethylene oxide. Ethylene is that's taken into the body is converted to ethylene oxide. A bacteria in the gut can produce it. It's also produced in exposure to cigarette smoke, fossil fuels, and forest fires. This has led to speculation by several authors that endogenous, as opposed to exogenous ethylene oxide, is responsible for most of the risk associated with the chemicals, and this is a very controversial view. I should point out that the authors of these two studies that you see below are made up of consultants to the ethylene oxide industry, and it doesn't necessarily mean that they're not earnest and ethical, but it's something to be considered. Again, cigarette smoking can lead to increased ethylene oxide blood concentrations. These data from the NHANES reports that come from the CDC and the National Center for Environmental Health showed that adolescents had about twice the amount of ethylene oxide in their blood if they were smokers than if they were non-smokers, and for adults it was about 5 times, based on adults smoking more cigarettes, essentially. In spite of all the dangers, there really are critical needs for EtO. We've seen some of the production that is done with it. It's important to household products that we use, to paper and safety in the sterilization of medical products. And in fact, the FDA says that it's currently used to treat 50% of sterile medical devices and about 20 billion medical devices per year. And they contend that it's the only safe and effective sterilization method currently available. So EPA is working with the FDA to try to find other potential methods of effective sterilization. And it should be noted that ethylene oxide has been banned in Europe for numerous uses, including food and agricultural uses since 1991. So there apparently are some other potential methods of sterilization that can be used for food and agricultural products. This is a question that I can't answer, but and it's something that society has to answer. But we have to question whether we can balance the benefits with the risk to be able to continue to use this product, or if other products need to replace it. I took a look at some of the values that are proposed for protection of workers and protection of the public, and the range of concentrations that are acceptable or potentially acceptable is enormous. At the high end, the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health give EtO an IDLH rating of 800 ppm. It's also listed as a carcinogen, so it's supposed to be minimally exposure is supposed to be at a minimum if possible. In the workplace, OSHA allows exposure limits of 1 part per million and 5 parts per million for a ceiling for a few minutes a day. And NIOSH recommends 1/10 of that for the permissible exposure limit or recommended exposure limit in their case of 0.1 ppm with the same ceiling as OSHA. ATSDR has attributed a minimal risk level of 0.09 ppm. And while EPA has not developed a reference dose, it estimates that 0.02 micrograms, I think it's 1 ppm of EtO would result in not greater than 1 in 10,000 increased chance of cancer. To really have an accurate thermometer, I would need to have 80,000 tick marks on it because of the differences here. So it's a huge range from immediately dangerous to life and health to protective against cancer. Another way to look at this, if we take that EPA estimate of an increase to 1 in 10,000 cancer cases for lifelong continuous inhalation of 2 times 10 to the minus 2 micrograms per meter, and we put that in the volume of the Superdome in New Orleans, which is 3.5 million meters cubed, we would find that essentially the contents of an aspirin tablet at 81 milligrams, it was the closest thing I could get to 70, dissolved in the air of the Superdome would give you the risk assessment. So it's a very small quantity for lifelong exposure that can be protective against further risk of cancer. The EPA put out a risk assessment a couple of years ago. 2 other risk evaluations were performed by the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality. And then Ethylene Oxide Task Force, which was proposed by a private contractor in toxicology. And those 2 groups found much lower risks than the one proposed by IRIS based on the same data. The Office of Pesticide Programs, which controls EtO, has not selected a single value for risk extrapolation, but instead, based on the body of qualitative and quantitative risk info that's available, believes that further mitigation of EtO exposure is required. And this falls squarely into what we're going to talk about later, in terms of protection based on the general risk. In terms of EtO exposures in children, we believe that they may be at greater risk for a number of reasons. Once again, the breathing spaces occupied by infants and children may be very different from those of adults. So if you live near an EtO exhausting facility, the concentration of heavier than air gases like EO is going to be increased at the level of the floor or halfway down there in terms of older children. So they're going to have greater exposures because of concentration and also because of higher respiratory rates. There are a number of environmental factors that are going to be important in what kind of exposures the children and adults receive. There's location where most of the time is spent. For children of, toddler age, most of that time may be spent at home or in the daycare. And for older children, they're going to be in school. And the location of the school relative to the EtO source or the daycare center may increase or decrease their risk depending on how much time they spend there and where it is in relation to the point source. There's also differences in indoor and outdoor activities. Younger children are going to be mostly indoors, toddlers and infants, whereas older children are going to have a lot of outdoor activities and may be exposed to higher concentrations because of that. Wind speed and direction is going to be important if you're downwind from the plant. Obviously, you're going to be at risk of having higher inhalation concentrations. There are also risks posed by underlying health and development issues. For one, if we look at pediatric lymphoma in general, and that's one of the most common cancers in children in general, boys typically are more at risk than girls. Whites are more at risk than non-whites. Children with immune deficiencies at birth with immunosuppressive drug therapy, who've had infectious mononucleosis or HIV or radiation treatment, are at increased risk for lymphoma in general. But interestingly, there's really only been one study of EtO related lymphomas in children, and that was at the Sterigenics plant in Willowbrook, Illinois, which was undertaken by the EPA and the company and the Illinois Department of Health. And they found that the only lymphomas that were seen in children were in females. So that was distinctly different. The other thing that is to consider are developmental factors. Children don't have a complete metabolism until they grow some. And so that can be a plus or a minus. Some carcinogens are actually activated by metabolism and some are broken down. And so that can affect the development of cancer. And their immune systems are typically not fully developed until at least the end of the first year of life. So does EtO cause cancer in children? If you ask the American Cancer Society, they say that cancers that occur during childhood or adolescence have few established risk factors, and most are thought to be random cell mutations without an external cause. I've long thought that was kind of a cop-out, because if you can't say what causes something, how can you say it's not what it might be? The solution to this is to do some studies in the areas where ethylene oxide is increased. Now, there are problems with prospective studies, but because of the time they take and the expense, but it's something that should be kept or approached with an open mind. The EPA, on the other hand, says that current understanding of biological processes involved in carcinogenesis leads to a reasonable expectation that children can be more susceptible to carcinogenic agents than adults. It's kind of old data, but I think it's important to keep an open mind here. And I mentioned this study already, an examination of childhood cancers using SIR ratios showed a significantly higher than expected number of childhood lymphomas in females around the Sterigenics EtO sterilization facility in Willowbrook, which is just west of Chicago. All of the other individual pediatric sites had SIRs that were based on fewer than 10 cases. And so they didn't see any other cancers like leukemia, for example. And this is important to keep in mind, even though cancer is the leading cause of medical death in children, not traumatic death. The leading cause of death is gunshot wounds today, but the leading cause of medical death is cancer. And even so, there are really a limited number of children who will develop one or more particular cancers early on. And so if you're looking for a cluster that might be indicative of causation at least suggestive of an association with a particular chemical like ethylene oxide. It's really hard to get the numbers of patients that you need to see to develop any kind of association. So I just want to focus for a minute on previous experiences that we've had with carcinogens. We didn't always believe that smoking cigarettes caused cancer. There were studies in the late 1920s to the late 1940s that suggested a link between smoking and lung cancer. Of course, the industry fought back against any suggestion of this, but the studies were not strong enough to establish a clear connection between smoking and lung cancer. In the 1950s, larger retrospective studies showed a link between cigarette smoking and cancer, but they still didn't make a convincing enough case to lead the legislation. And then there were two case control studies, one in the UK and one in the United States in 1950, that pretty much established that cigarette smoking causes cancer, but at the cost of thousands of people who died over those 30 years in which they were trying to establish the link. The same is true for asbestos. Asbestos started in the 1800s, mostly in the 1890s in the United States. Scientific papers started coming out as early as 1905 that indicated concerns for occupational disease from asbestos. And in the 1930s to 1960s, there was more and more evidence of an association between asbestos and cancer. Germany actually declared asbestos to be carcinogenic in 1943. But the United States could not find consensus on the issue until 1964. Lack of experimental and epidemiological evidence played a major role in delaying a consensus, as did manufacturers beating down every door to try to disprove any association. The EPA banned most uses of asbestos in 1989, and because of the long times it takes to develop asbestosis or lung cancer or mesothelioma, we're still seeing deaths from asbestos today. So I would argue that you have to assume that known carcinogens like EtO may be responsible for childhood cancer. We have very few epidemiological studies done, and so our database is very small. Prospective studies are expensive, take years to complete, and are generally impractical. And we're dealing with very small numbers of cases. But these cases are important people. They're children who are important and cherished by their relatives and the people around them. So I asked the question, is it prudent to wait 50 to 100 years to prove that EtO causes cancer in children? And I think not. So what is EPA doing to decrease the risk of EtO-related cancers? This is the National Air Toxics and Urban Air Toxics Monitoring Sites. EPA has been monitoring concentrations of ethylene oxide in numerous manufacturing and use facilities throughout the United States. They've recently concluded that computer generated estimates probably are more effective than trying to do constant monitoring. But they have published some very interesting data from this NAT system. One of the studies that's been recently published by I forget the name now. Sorry. involved scientists from EPA and private consultants that were testing next generation emission measurements to detect EtO releases at facilities over a period of 4 days. Used in combination with mobile devices and stationary state-of-the-art testing equipment, they were able to monitor EtO in and near the facility operations. In those testing episodes, they found multiple releases lasting seconds to minutes that exceeded 500 parts per billion volume during rail car switchovers and batch reactor washouts. And a level of 30 parts per billion was recorded hundreds of meters from the unit. So some elevation of units. And this was after the company had put in new and other mitigation devices. 4.6% of mobile readings exceeded 1.2 parts per billion volume, and between 17 and 82% of readings were above 1 part per billion volume. The authors concluded that while additional work is needed to implement this type of next generation emissions measurement, that ultimately it can complement traditional inspections and help facilities detect and mitigate unnecessary emissions that may arise over time. One thing that's been brought up by Ken Mont, who's a colleague of mine in a private toxicology group, looks at the peak exposures rather than looking at just accumulated exposures or averages. And he points out that in most of the risk data that's been published, that there's really very little analysis of peak exposure metrics. It seems reasonable that if you have high peaks, even for a short period of time, that they may have more impact on cell injury than smaller regular exposures. So he suggests that uniform definitions of peak exposures need to be established, especially where mechanistic understanding indicates that dose response is unlikely linear and that short-term high-intensity exposures increase risk. And this seems logical to me, although I'm not a risk assessment specialist by any means. Some of the EPA actions in 2023 to protect workers and communities from ethylene oxide exposure include reducing EtO emissions from chemical plants where polymers and ethylene glycol are made. And the estimate is that they could reduce 6,053 tons of air toxics per year, including EtO. So that's a 63% reduction compared to nationwide estimated EtO emissions in 2020. They also are acting on commercial sterilizers to increase to strengthen emission standards for 86 commercial sterilizers around the country. And they also have plans to reduce the risk to workers and sterilization industry through new protections under FIFRA. EPA will also propose a requirement that requires registrants to submit data on commercially available technologies that can monitor lower concentrations real time, and is proposing that registrants submit worker monitoring data to EPA after the implementation of the proposed mitigations. Looking closer to home, in Region 6, we have a number of facilities that use ethylene oxide, 2 here in El Paso, 1 in San Angelo, several around Houston and Baton Rouge, one in Ardmore, Oklahoma. And you'll notice in Ardmore and Athens, Texas, Ardmore, Oklahoma, Athens, Texas, and Laredo, that the emissions have been associated with elevated cancer risks, according to EPA. And so those have gotten a lot of attention lately. This is kind of the map of what's out there in terms of EtO in our region. You can see that there are a couple of places that have more than 5 tons of emissions in the year, and several in the 2.5 tons to less than 5 tons. Texas gets a special mention because we have more poisonous ethylene oxide than anybody else in the region. And Shell gets a special mention because they emitted greater than 6 tons in 2020. Their motto is "Together, anything is possible." So we should think about some things we can do together. There are 19 chemical plants, 14 unspecified facilities, 9 commercial sterilizers, 3 pulp and paper mills, 1 landfill, and 1 plastic resin and rubber facility in this group of facilities. And these are the sterilization facilities that are in the region. There's 1 in Arkansas, none listed for Louisiana, 1 in New Mexico, essentially in El Paso, 1 in Ardmore, Oklahoma, and several in Texas, Athens, El Paso, 2 in El Paso, actually. Grand Prairie has a couple, Houston, Laredo, and San Angelo. Ethylene oxide is clearly an environmental justice issue as well, and it's true both in the United States and in our region. If you compare to the county average, the proportion of people of color is greater within 5 miles of the plant in all of the installations that you see there that have an upward black arrow. If we look at people with decreased English language skills, which is indicated by the downward E arrow, all of those are increased to people who are less fluent in English within 5 miles of the sites. And the proportion of low-income families is seen with the green downward arrow, and essentially the majority of the sites in Region 6. So these are issues that need to be addressed. Want to look briefly at the Laredo plant, the Midwest Sterilization Corporation. ETA in July 22 identified Midwest sterilization along with 22 other facilities as contributing to increased cancer risk. This map was initially published, which shows essentially a 2 by 3 mile area where the risk of cancer was considered to be increased by at least 1 in 10,000. The map subsequently being archived because according to EPA, it no longer portrays everything we know about risk, but it does illustrate that a good swath of the city was subject to increased cancer risk. The Sterilization Corporation has been operating in Laredo since 2005. It's one of the largest in the country. It's permitted to use a maximum of 7,000 pounds per day of EtO. It has worked to decrease EtO emissions by putting in wet scrubbers, which decreased levels significantly. A third wet acid packed scrubber tower went online in April 2020. However, the majority of the risk, it seems, is being caused by fugitive emissions. These are not what's coming out of the smokestack or where you would expect it to come out, but by leaks that are essentially hidden. And this was noted in the Chicago study as well. The timeline for these changes is they're being proposed this year, public comment, of course, and then a final rule, hopefully this year. And it may have happened by now. I'm not sure where we are with that exactly. But once the rule is final, facilities typically have 3 years to comply. And there are more things to read about ethylene oxide, a tremendous wealth of knowledge at the EPA websites. Just a point about Laredo. It could be about any of these places. When we talk about risk, we talk about 1 in 10,000, 1 in 100,000. They're numbers, and these are not numbers. These are people, and it's important that we keep that in mind as we establish goals for decreasing ethylene oxide exposure. So, what can industry do? In the study done in Chicago, the scrubbers that had already been put in decreased emissions by about 99%, which is tremendous. And they found that these advanced emission monitors were very helpful, but they had to be complemented with traditional inspections, manual inspections, to avoid missing these missed fugitive emissions. I'm coming to an end here. I apologize if I'm going over. There were more than 200 tests of outdoor and indoor environments at Sterigenics in Willowbrook, and EPA risk levels were found to be up to 3 miles from the plant. Not long after the sampling ended in 2019, Sterigenics, in spite of reducing EtO emissions by 90%, closed the facility permanently. And this was really due to an outcry of the public, the communities that lived nearby. They wouldn't tolerate the obfuscation and what they recognized as reckless disregard for their health and safety. And so Sterigenics closed that facility in 2019, I believe. So we'll come down to the end of this with a little bit of mention of the precautionary principle. There was a conference that came together in 1998 called the Wing Spray Conference, where they looked at risk assessment and how it was done. And the conclusions of this conference were that when an activity raises threats of harm to the environment or human health, precautionary measures should be taken, even if some cause and effect relationships are not fully established scientifically. Risk assessment and cost-benefit analysis give the benefit of the doubt to new products, which may later prove harmful. When damage occurs, victims have the difficult task of proving that a product or activity was responsible. So that responsibility really should be on the industry. The precautionary principle shifts the burden of proof such that those responsible for an activity must vouch for its harmlessness and be held responsible if damage occurs. In medicine, we talk about first do no harm, primum non nocere. And a similar principle should be present in industry, and that's responsibile pro sui actus est. One is responsible for his actions. So in conclusion, ethylene oxide is an animal and human carcinogen capable of affecting adults and children. There's disagreement as to the doses of EtO necessary to result in increased cancer cases in the community. Current risk assessments place a number of cities in high risk of developing cancer. The impact is measured not in numbers, but in its effect on people. EPA is doing its part to decrease EtO community concentrations. A proof of concept mobile and fixed EtO measurement program showed that significant interventions by industry can drastically decrease emissions, but that they still occur at high concentrations on occasion, requiring a manual monitoring program and mitigation to keep levels at their lowest. In my opinion, We should not wait 50 or 100 years to settle the how much is too much question. The precautionary principle must carry the day. So, Shell, if together anything is possible, how about a significant decrease in your 6 tons of emissions? That's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Borron, for that really informative presentation. There were actually a number of questions that had come through, but I wanted to save them to the end so that you'd be able to continue through the formal presentation there. The first one was a question wanting to find out if they'd be able to get copies of either the slides or recordings.
Absolutely.
Okay, and we'll work to help coordinate that. One of the questions earlier on was if there was a relationship between ethylene oxide and hemolytic anemia, if you had any comments there.
The hemolytic anemia, I'm not aware. It certainly has been associated with decreased numbers of red blood cells, hemoglobin, it certainly can cause essentially pancytopenia, but I'm not aware of it causing hemolytic anemia. But it's certainly a possibility. It's just not something I ran onto or looked for in this talk.
There was a question about if there is any data indicating concentrations of indoor versus outdoor ethylene oxide.
Another excellent question, and I don't have the answers to that. Perhaps one of our EPA colleagues on the line may have some knowledge of that, and if they can help us out with an answer, that would be very helpful. I think it's going to vary from place to place, depending on the kind of building construction that there is, how many air exchanges that you have in an hour, where your house is relative to the plant location, whether it's upwind or downwind, and how far we're talking about from the point source. But that's a very good question. I'll look and see if I can find information on that.
Another question was, are there any ongoing epidemiological studies specific to community exposure of ethylene oxide near emitters such as sterilizers, manufacturers, or if plans that you may have heard about for these types of studies?
EPA is certainly continuing to look at the exposures in these particularly in sterilization facilities, but in other places, whether there are formal epidemiologic studies being done, I could not find any. I did a PubMed search for childhood cancer and EtO, and really found nothing at all. And I may have missed it by not doing the right search, but I found very little to really. The only pediatric study that I could find was a study done by the Department of Health in Illinois and the EPA working with them.
Another question that come in near the end here is, do you know what, if any, or sorry, not editorialize, how does the EPA choose which plants to monitor? The further comment was, in my home state of Colorado, there seemed to be 3 sterilization plants, but as far as they could tell, only one was being monitored. I don't know if you can comment on the EPA process there, but anything that you may have heard.
I would assume that it's probably based on the national toxics reports, where they come in higher than the average, but I don't know that to be a fact. And once again, if one of our EPA colleagues is online who can address this, I would appreciate their input.
There was also just a couple of comments to help hold people's attention. There was a resource that was posted. It says, new resource today, the ITRC announced the release of the ITRC ethylene oxide emission guidance for 2023, and there was a link placed to that in case that's of interest to anyone.
Okay. Maybe we can add that to the last slide or something, and so that we have a QR code to find it.
Let me just try and scan. I apologize if I missed any questions. This was one of the most popular sessions to have follow-up questions. I guess that showed quite a bit of interest in the topic. And again, want to thank you, Dr. Borron, for sharing, and thank everybody for attending today. We will work to get a recording of the slides and see if we can add in that extra resource as a QR at the end.
Thank you very much, Dr. Crawford, and to the participants for listening in. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Borron. Thank you all. We'll see you next month.